Hey everybody, welcome to the Philosophy Garage. I am Professor Parsons, and in this video I'm going to be talking about Peter van Inwagen's account of the local argument from evil. All right, and here I'll be referring to William Raos' article. Can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. Something about the problem of evil and varieties of atheism. Yeah, the problem of evil and certain varieties of atheism. All right, so I'll be talking about gratuitous evils and also be introducing another term, horrendous destructive evils. Okay, now, so what we mean by a gratuitous instance of evil, according to William Raos, would be this. So an evil is gratuitous if it is an evil that a wholly good being could prevent without sacrificing anything of greater moral worth, or it is the kind of thing that an evil that a wholly good being could prevent without failing to prevent anything bad or worse. So according to William Raos, in order for a wholly good being to be justified in failing to prevent a given instance of evil, that evil would need to, in some sense, be necessary. So according to William Raos, and this is the main crux of his argument, the existence of a wholly good being, a being that's omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, is inductively incompatible with the existence of certain kinds of evil. With gratuitous evils in particular. Okay, now, and this is why it's called, this is why Vaughn and Waggin calls it the local argument from evil, because evidential arguments from evil or inductive arguments from evil don't say that God's existence is logically incompatible with the existence of any evil at all. It would just be that given the evidential weight of certain kinds of evils, either the amounts of evil in the world or the particularly horrific nature of certain kinds of evils, it makes atheism more likely to be true than theism. Okay, now, so just to cover a version of William Raos' argument, this is a different way of phrasing the argument than what Raos actually uses, but this is actually a little bit simpler. Okay, so first of all, there are instances of gratuitous evil. Okay, so there are instances of evil that, all things considered, are pointless. They're not necessary for some greater good, and they're not necessary for preventing something equally bad or worse. And then premise two, if God existed, God would prevent gratuitous evils. Okay, so what premise two is basically affirming is that God's existence is incompatible with the existence of gratuitous evil. If you accept premise two, you think that, yeah, well, if God existed, there aren't any pointless evils. There aren't any gratuitous evils. All right, but one and two then give us reason to accept three, therefore God does not exist. So once again, there are instances of gratuitous evil. There are instances of evil that a wholly good being could prevent without sacrificing anything of greater moral worth or without failing to prevent anything equally bad or worse. And it seems reasonable that if God existed, there would be no such instances of gratuitous evil. If God existed, God would prevent gratuitous evils. The only evils that would exist would be those that are in some sense necessary. So from 1 and 2, if we think 1 and 2 are reasonable, we are inclined to also think that conclusion 3, therefore God does not exist, is reasonable. Okay, now, as far as various ways of responding to this argument are concerned, this is what William Raos says. William Raos thinks that the best strategy is for the theist to undercut premise 1. Raos does not think that the theist is in a position to directly refute premise 1. To directly refute premise 1 would be to say that there are no instances of gratuitous evil whatsoever, and Raos says no theist is in a position to be able to know that. So no theist would really be justified in believing that. So the best strategy here for the theist, or the best solution for the theist, is to indirectly challenge 1. All right. Now, we could do that through skeptical theism, the idea that we are not in a reasonable epistemic situation to be able to tell whether any instances of evil are actually gratuitous or not. So it's not that we would be thinking that premise 1 is false, but if we're undercutting premise 1, all we would be saying is that we don't have any particularly good reasons for thinking that premise 1 is actually true. So if you and I epistemically are not in a position, if you and I epistemically are not in a position to be able to tell whether or not any instances of evil are gratuitous, pointless, and the like, then we don't have any particular good reason to accept premise 1. But not having a reason to accept premise 1 is not a reason for rejecting premise 1. So remember, like we talked about with logic a long time ago, reasons for non-acceptance are not the same thing as reasons for rejection. So the fact that I don't have reason to accept the premise, a premise in an argument, doesn't mean that I have sufficient reason to reject that premise. So there's a difference between not believing a premise and then thinking that that premise is actually false. Okay. Now, the other thing that we could do is try to shift the argument. So William Rao talks about what's called the G.E. Moore shift here, which in epistemology is used to challenge certain kinds of skeptical claims. So the example we talked about in epistemology was, I know I have hands, or I seem, let me start over. So the skeptical argument might go something like this. If external world skepticism is true, then I don't know I have hands. Well, external world skepticism is true, therefore I don't know I have hands. Well, if you find that conclusion absurd, you could shift the argument. So the original argument, if external world skepticism is true, then I don't know I have hands. External world skepticism is true, therefore I don't know I have hands. Now, if you want to shift the argument, you could say this. If external world skepticism is true, I don't know I have hands, but I do know I have hands, therefore external world skepticism is false. Okay, so with respect to a shift to this argument, we could say, if God exists, there would be no instances of gratuitous evil. Well, God does exist, therefore there are no instances of gratuitous evil. So it could be that our reasons for believing in God, or the evidence in favor of God's existence, it might be greater than the evidence for the existence of gratuitous, pointless evils and the like. Okay, so if there's some argument out there, that's a compelling argument for theism, a compelling argument for the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good being, and that argument is more reasonable than the local argument from evil or the evidential argument from evil, then we have reasons to be theists rather than be atheists. So Rao, in particular, thinks that that is the best kind of strategy that the theist has available to them. Okay, now, here's what Peter van Inwagen is going to do. So Rao thinks that almost every theist would accept premise 2 of the argument, this idea that God would prevent gratuitous evils, that if God existed, God would prevent gratuitous evils, or if God existed, there would be no gratuitous evils, however you want to frame it. Vaughn and Waggin actually thinks that the best strategy is to reject premise 2. Vaughn and Waggin, in particular, thinks that premise 2 of the argument, that if God existed, God would prevent gratuitous evils, he thinks that premise is false. So what Peter van Inwagen is saying in his article is that no, God's existence is compatible with the existence of gratuitous evils. And Vaughn and Waggin himself thinks it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear that there are not only instances of gratuitous evils, evils that are pointless, evils that God does not need to accomplish their purposes. There are actually horrendous evils. There are actually evils that, for the individuals that experience them, they kind of make life not worth living, or they are sort of, a term that gets used elsewhere is they're just kind of existentially burdensome. We feel the weight of those evils so tremendously that they just kind of break us as individuals. We experience certain evils that are so weighty existentially that we're not quite sure if we can carry on as human individuals. Vaughn and Waggin thinks that, oh yeah, well, of course there are gratuitous evils. There are horrendous evils. So all horrendous evils would be gratuitous, but not all gratuitous evils would be horrendous. Now, I myself agree with this. So in a paper, well, it's a paper you guys are going to be reading. I think paper cuts and toe stubbings are gratuitous. I mean, they're evil. Why? They cause pain, and pain is intrinsically bad. But do toe stubbings and paper cuts make life unbearable? So I don't think any instance of a paper cut or any instance of a toe stubbing really is the kind of thing that God needs to allow to happen in order to accomplish their goals, if God existed. So if I stub my toe today, I don't think it's true that God let it happen because there's some greater good that's going to be accomplished by my stubbing my toe. Now, but I also think that I'm inclined to think that even if I stubbed my toe every day for my entire life, I still think on the whole, my life is worth living. So I experience gratuitous evils every day, but they're not necessarily horrendous or destructive. They don't make life not worth living. All right. So, and if you think about those kinds of things, so I stubbed my toe and it's an instance of gratuitous evil. God, why didn't you prevent me from stubbing my toe? I think God would just kind of say, get over it. Really? I mean, yeah, it's a gratuitous instance of evil, but it doesn't make your life not worth living. So just kind of deal with it. All right. So even though toe stubbings and paper cuts, I would say, are gratuitous, they're not necessary for God to accomplish their goals. God doesn't need every instance of a toe stubbing or a paper cut to accomplish their purposes in the world. But life is still worth living despite all the paper cuts and toe stubbings, I would say. So yeah, I think they're gratuitously evil, but I don't think they're particularly horrendous or destructive. Okay, now, so what Vaughn and Waggin is doing here, Vaughn and Waggin's response to the local problem of evil, which is, again, it's the idea that certain evils in the world are the kinds of things that God could have left out without thwarting their plans for the world. A local instance of evil is a particularly weighty or gratuitous instance of evil that God could have prevented. God could have left out that instance of evil in the world, and still God's will for the world and God's plans for the world, everything is hunky-dory here. But Vaughn and Waggin thinks that these kinds of evils in some sense are necessary. So he thinks this is a expanded free will defense here. Okay, so Vaughn and Waggin says that with respect to God's purposes and plans for the world, God does need to allow some evil to accomplish their purposes. And Vaughn and Waggin in particular thinks that part of God's purposes and plans for the world are to freely draw us into God's self for intimate personal relationship with God. So what God largely desires above anything else is to be intimate and close with us, their special creatures in the created order. But this kind of intimacy or love is the kind of thing which needs to be entered into freely. You can't force somebody to love you. So when God gave us free will to choose to freely be in relationship with God, the flip side of that is that we now have the power and the freedom to reject relationship with God. Now, so why does God need some evil in the world in order to accomplish this purpose? Well, in one sense, if nothing bad ever happened to us, Vaughn and Waggin thinks that we would not be in a position to recognize our need for God. So if God did not allow us to suffer, if God did not allow us to experience certain kinds of evil, we wouldn't recognize kind of the deep existential need that we have for God. So if everything always went well for us all the time in this life, we would be inclined to think that that is all that living well consists in, or that is all that value or well-being consists in. So, I mean, imagine this. You're filthy, stinking rich. You want for nothing. You have everything you've ever needed and everything you've ever wanted. You never stub your toe or get a paper cut. There's always cold beer in the fridge. You bite into a piece of pizza and the hot melted cheese never sticks to the roof of your mouth and burns it. There's never annoying noises that keep you awake at night, whether it be water dripping. The birds don't chirp at 5 o'clock in the morning, annoyingly waking you up. You can tell I have a lot of problems with the world, with the things I'm listing here. Those kinds of things never happen. Okay. And so because materially and intellectually all what you believe your needs and wants are being met in this life, God comes to you and says, hey, believe it or not, despite all of these good things you have in your life, and these are good things, mind you, yummy pizza that doesn't burn the roof of your mouth, and a good night's sleep, and money, and friendship, and all of these things are valuable. They do have an extreme amount of value. But you know what the best thing is, God says? The best thing you could ever desire, what is fundamentally desire and valuable more than anything else, is being intimate with me, freely entering into a friendship, a bondship with me, God. That is the best thing. And it's not only the best thing, that is what you really need. Now, if everything was going well for you and God were to come to you and say, hey, the best thing, despite all the wonderful things you have in your life, the best possible state of affairs you could ever be in is being in an intimate friendship and loving relationship with me, God, the creator of the entire universe, you would probably look around and go, I don't know what you're talking about. I have no need to recognize my need for this. I mean, look, I have all this money, I have pizza, I have cold beer, I've never stubbed my toe, all of this. What is it about my life? What evidence is there in my life that I am deeply in need of God in my life? And if you look at, statistically, when it comes to people praying and it comes to people maybe that are kind of nominally religious, kind of being more invested in their religion and things like that, it does seem that we develop mutual bonds of companionship and friendship in times of crisis, in times of suffering. It's in times of crisis and suffering that we come together and share each other's burdens, and we share each other's pains and sufferings and things like that. I mean, the very notion of compassion requires suffering. There can't be compassion without any suffering. So if a world with compassion and love in particular is a better world than a world that lacks compassion and love, potentially, then some suffering and some evil is a necessary condition for there being any kind of compassion or love or anything like that. Now, and if that's true, if allowing us to suffer or allowing us to experience evil is necessary for God to accomplish their purposes, then God needs to create a world and allow it to have at least some evil or some suffering in it. Okay, so that certainly is true. Now, but the move that Vaughn and Waggin makes is this. He makes the move that there is no fact of the matter concerning the sufficient and necessary amounts or kinds of evil that God needs. So God needs to allow some evil in the world to accomplish their purposes, but there's no fact of the matter concerning the specific range of evils that God needs to allow to happen. Now, what we mean by a sufficient and necessary condition would be this. So there's no amount of evil that's necessary, meaning if God allows evils below that threshold, God can't accomplish their purposes. And there's no fact of the matter about what amount of evil is sufficient, meaning anything more than that, anything above that sufficient amount or kind of evil is going to be extra evil that God doesn't actually need. Vaughn and Waggin says there's no magic number here. Now, so what does God do then? When God creates the world, God creates it with an arbitrary amount of evil. So it is vague. The amount of evil and kinds of evil that there are incredibly vague. So for any given instance of evil that actually happens, whether or not it's gratuitous, that is going to be a vague question. It's actually vague about how much or what kinds of gratuitous evils that there are in the world. Now, but if you pinpoint a particular kind of evil and say, did God need that amount of evil? So did God need me to stub my toe today or smash my thumb with a hammer or get a paper cut? It seems the answer is no. It seems the answer is no. God could have left that evil out and still accomplished their purpose. But God just wasn't required to. God was not morally required to guarantee that there are no gratuitous amounts of evil in the world. Why? Any world that God creates is going to have gratuitous evils. Any world that God creates is going to have a completely arbitrary amount of evil. Any world that God creates is going to contain pointless evils that God does not need to accomplish their purposes. So if it's true that any world that God creates is going to contain an arbitrary amount of evil, and some of those evils are going to be pointless, gratuitous, unnecessary, the only options that God has are create a world with an arbitrary amount of evil in it, or don't create a world at all. Now, and if it's better for God to create than to not create, if it's better for God to create a world with beings like us in it than to not create a world at all, then any world that God creates is going to have an arbitrary amount of evil in it, so we find ourselves in a world with an arbitrary amount of evil in it. So what Peter van Inwagen denies is this, and I'll get to the Blodgett example momentarily. What Peter van Inwagen denies is that a wholly good being like God is morally required to prevent all instances of gratuitous evil. He thinks that is false. So Vaughn and Waggin thinks that a wholly good being is not morally required to prevent all instances of gratuitous evil. Now, so this is where we get into his example with Blodgett. All right. So you are a magistrate who has the power to release individuals. Okay, so an individual comes before you named Blodgett, and Blodgett has been sentenced to 10 years in prison for felonious homicide. Okay, and let's assume for the sake of argument that punishment in the legal system is designed to correct behavior. It's designed to discourage future behavior. It's designed to rehabilitate. Okay, so Blodgett comes to you and says, well, sir or madam, as you know, the purpose of punishment is to correct behavior or to rehabilitate criminals. So any amount of suffering or any amount of prison that I am in that is over and above what is necessary, any amount of time that I spend in prison over and above what is necessary to rehabilitate me or to correct my behavior would be gratuitous. It would be unjust and evil. And since you are morally required to prevent instances of gratuitous evils, any amount in time that I've spent in prison that's more than what's necessary to rehabilitate me is gratuitously evil, and you've got to do something about it. So I've been sentenced to 10 years in prison. However, there's no reason to believe that by lowering my sentence by a day, 9 years, 364 days, there's no reason to believe that that one day could make that big of a difference. Where if I spend 9 years, 364 days in prison, I won't be rehabilitated. But if I spend 9 years, 365 days in prison, 10 years in prison, I will be rehabilitated. So there's no reason to believe that, shortening my sentence by one day will make a difference in accomplishing the purpose of rehabilitating me or correcting my behavior. But since an extra day in prison would be gratuitously evil, and we are morally required to prevent gratuitous evils, pointless evils when we can, you, magistrate, are morally required to release me a day early. So you as the magistrate say, okay, I guess I agree here. I officially declare that you're going to get out of prison a day early. And before you, pound the gavel, Blodgett says, okay, well, then clearly, if I can be rehabilitated by spending 9 years, 364 days in prison, one more day couldn't make that big of a difference, right? So if I can be rehabilitated by spending 9 years, 364 days in prison, I could clearly be rehabilitated by spending 9 years, 363 days in prison, right? So that extra day, once again, would be gratuitous. And since we're morally required to prevent gratuitous evils when we can, you got to let me out of prison 2 days early. And you sort of sigh and say, yeah, I guess you're right. There's no reason to think that 2 days would make that big of a difference. So, and before you can pound the gavel again, Blodgett says, up, 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 up. But clearly, if I would be rehabilitated by spending 9 years, 363 days in prison, I would be rehabilitated by spending 9 years, 362 days in prison. Now, the whole point is that by adding an extra day, right? An extra day won't make that big of a difference. An extra day won't make that big of a difference. An extra day won't make that big of a difference. Blodgett could keep reducing their sentence to the point where they spend a day in prison, 23 hours in prison, 22 hours in prison, and the like. Maybe they could reduce their sentence to 10 minutes in prison. Who knows? Now, but it seems that it would be absurd for you as the magistrate to bow into Blodgett's request this way, right? So the whole point is that there's no magic number, there's no definitive amount of time that Blodgett needs to spend in prison in order to be rehabilitated. So the minimum sentence, let's say it's a minimum sentence of 10 years for felonious assault, that's an arbitrary form of punishment. There's no reason to believe, there's no magic formula, objective formula that we use to say, well, you need 10 years in prison. Anything more than that, anything more than 10 years in prison is more than you need to be rehabilitated. Anything less than that, you won't be rehabilitated. There's no reason to think that that's true. Now, so Vaughn and Waggin thinks it's false, that he thinks the moral principle that in general we're morally required to prevent any instances of gratuitous evil when we can, he thinks that's false. And if it's false for us, it's false for God as well. So a wholly good being is not morally required to prevent gratuitous instances of evil. Now, and if a wholly good being is not morally required to prevent any gratuitous instances of evil, then that means that the existence of gratuitous evil is compatible with the existence of a wholly good being. Okay, now, what does Vaughn and Waggin have to say about this kind of pastorally? Is this any comfort to individuals that are suffering? Absolutely not. It's no comfort to individuals that are suffering. In fact, I would highly recommend that you not use these kinds of arguments with individuals that are actually experiencing suffering. That's one of the worst things that you can do. Now, but Vaughn and Waggin points out, so this is no comfort, and if it is comfort, it's cold comfort. However, the purpose of talking about arguments from evil and the purpose of trying to give defenses for theism is not to comfort individuals. The purpose is to determine what the facts are. The purpose is to determine whether or not God's existence is logically or evidentially incompatible with the existence of gratuitous evil. And the answer to that question is no. Vaughn and Waggin does not think that the existence of God, the existence of a wholly good being, is either logically or evidentially incompatible with the existence of gratuitous evil. So again, the fact that there's an arbitrary amount of evil in the world, or there's no fact of the matter about the individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions about amounts and kinds of evil that God needs to accomplish their purposes. The fact we don't have answers to those questions might boggle our minds and drive us into an existential crisis. Sure, but we can't say from this alone that the existence of gratuitous evils makes God's existence highly unlikely or is logically incompatible with God's existence. Now, and Vaughn and Waggin thinks that the burden of proof now is on the atheist to say, no, there is some definitive number here. There is some magic number that anything more than this amount of evil is gratuitous and God is not justified in allowing, and anything less than that, God can't accomplish their purposes. Vaughn and Waggin says, I'm skeptical that there is such a magic number or magic amount. So if the atheist wants to say that God's existence is incompatible with the existence of gratuitous evil, the atheist now has the burden of proof to specify what that magic number is, what that formula is and eliminate the instances of vague evil in the world. All right. Okay, in the next video, we'll talk about whether or not, even if all of these kinds of arguments work, whether or not you can actually trust God in the face of gratuitous or horrendous evil. So we'll see you then.